I'm Tammy Kolda, an applied mathematician, and this is Unlocking LaTeX Graphics. On this channel, I provide tutorials on TikZ and PGF plots, which are tools in LaTeX for creating graphics that compile right along with your document. I've been using these tools for a long time in my research papers, so I understand your frustrations. This is one of a sequence of videos where I cover the contents of my book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics, linked in the show notes. If you like this channel, please subscribe, post comments, and share with your friends and colleagues. Today's topic is using TikZ arrows, including different arrowheads, setting the default arrow, scaling and changing the color of the arrow, and the path shorten key, which is useful along with arrows. I'm assuming you've already watched the previous videos or are familiar with TikZ. If not, these are linked in the show notes below. As usual, we'll do our teching today at overleaf.com, a great online LaTeX editor. So let's go ahead and start a new project. We'll call this Using Arrows and TikZ Graphics. We'll start off with the standard blank document, and we'll go ahead and get rid of the graphics X package because we don't need that today, and we'll use package TikZ as usual. I like to use the package parskip because that makes things a little bit neater. And then what's special today is we'll use the TikZ library arrows.meta, and that will give us access to some extra arrowheads that you might prefer to the default arrowhead. We'll start with the basics of drawing arrows. I've already posted a little segment of code here. Let's go ahead and compile that. What we have is a path from 0, 0 to 2, 0 that we've drawn. Now if we want to add an arrow to that path, we go and we add an optional argument to the draw command. Putting it in square brackets, we put a dash and a greater than. So now if we recompile, we have a path with an arrow at its end. If we wanted instead an arrow at the beginning, you put a less than and a dash, and now we have an arrow at the beginning of the path. And if we want arrows at both ends, we put less than dash greater than, and we have now arrows at both ends. Arrows really only appear at the ends. They don't appear at each line segment. So let me show you an example with several line segments. We have points here. Each point is connected to its neighbor with a line to operation, making a continuous path. And then at the very end, we have the arrow. We don't have it at the end of each line segment. So that's important to remember. The other thing to notice is that arrows do not appear on cycles. So if we have another little segment of code here. If we compile this, we have a path that makes a right angle, and there's an arrow at its end. If I were to connect it back to the beginning by going back to 0, 0, the start of the path, we do have an arrow in the way I've drawn it because it's just a path and there's an arrow at the end. If instead of 0, 0, I put cycle, now TikZ understands that this is not a simple path. It is a cycle with no beginning and no end. And so it doesn't draw an arrowhead. So it really understands what's going on when you use cycle, and that's why we generally recommend using cycle to close up a path rather than just going back to the original point. Now let's talk about using different arrowheads. I had you put in this use TikZ library arrows.meta, but we haven't actually used it yet. This is what contains alternative arrowheads. So I prepared a little segment of code to get us started. So here's something that draws a path with an arrow at one end. What if I want to change that arrow? One alternate arrowhead is something called triangle with a capital T, and you will see that it will give a triangle shaped arrowhead. If I recompile, we get the triangle that you see here. Now, if I put an arrowhead at the beginning of the line, and I just do it with a regular arrowhead, I'll have two different arrowheads going on in this line. If I wanted to make all of them the same, I could type triangle at both ends. This becomes quite tedious. So instead of that, I can do something a little different. I can set the default arrowhead to be triangle. So I put arrowhead, the greater than sign, equal triangle. And that says any arrowheads that appear here are going to be triangles. And then I'll just say put arrows at both ends. And we'll compile that and see what we get. So now we have the same thing. So that's setting the default arrowhead. Now, maybe I want every arrow in my picture to be a triangle, in which case I can put it in the arguments to the TikZ picture. So I've gone up and I put in the optional arguments of TikZ picture. The default arrowhead is triangle. And now if I add another line here with another arrow, this will automatically have the triangle arrowhead. There are a bunch of different arrowheads that you can use, much more than I will list here, but I'll just give you a bunch of my favorites so that you can see them. So let me go ahead and paste a little segment of code here and compile, and we'll see all the different arrow types. So the default is here, and we have what's called the LaTeX arrowhead, the stealth arrowhead, the triangle arrowhead, and the straight barb arrowhead. So those are just 5 of the arrowheads, and if you go to the TikZ manual, you'll see a long list of alternate arrowheads that you can try out. Now we'll go ahead and talk about the style of the arrowhead. Maybe you want to adjust it, change its color, change in particular its scale, or make other changes. How do you do that? So I prepared a little segment of code for us to play with. Let me go ahead and paste that and compile and zoom in here. So we have our basic arrowhead. Suppose that we want to change it. So the first thing we would do is put curly braces around the arrowhead that we're using. So I'm using just the regular arrowhead. It could be the name of an arrowhead if you haven't set a default and you want something different. And then at the end of the arrowhead, inside of the curly braces that are surrounding it, I put square brackets, and then I could do something. For example, I could change the color of just the arrowhead to be blue. It will take the default color of the path unless I specify the color here. So now that's blue. That's maybe too small for my purposes, or too big, depending on the situation, but I'm going to say it's too small, so I can change its scale inside these square brackets, which are inside these curly braces along with the arrowhead pointer, and I can change the scale to be, say, 3. And so now I have a much bigger arrowhead. And maybe I also want to change the line width. You can't use thick in this, but you can say line width equals whatever you want it to be. So we'll say 3 pt, make it nice and thick. And so now I have this nice thick arrowhead that I've customized and stylized. So the basic idea is you put curly braces around the arrowhead to get everything contained, and then square brackets immediately following the arrowhead, and then your options inside that. In this last segment, I'll just give you a trick to do with paths that I find useful to use together with arrows. It's called the shorten key. So I prepared a little segment of code that we can play with. So let me go ahead and paste that here and compile it. And then we'll scroll down to where that appears. And so we have here a square, colored orange, one arrow pointing to its lower left corner and another arrow coming out of its lower right corner. And so here's the code over to the side. This arrow is going right up and into the square. Maybe I wanted to not do that. So I could mess around with the endpoint, but this becomes a little awkward. The other thing I can do is just say shorten space, and then I want to do the n, so I do a greater than signs equals how much I want to shorten it by. So I'll do 1 millimeter. And so now it's just pulled that back ever so slightly. So in some sense, the path still extends, but where it draws is short by 1 millimeter. And then likewise, I might want to pull a little bit off of the beginning of this arrow. So I can say shorten space less than sign. That means take off of the beginning equals 1 millimeter. You can't do the beginning and the end in one fell swoop. You have to actually enter both of these commands to shorten at both ends, but still a lot nicer than trying to fine-tune exactly where your points are in many cases. Thank you for your attention today. If you like this video, please hit like or subscribe. That really helps. And as always, I will link the overleaf document that I created today in the show notes. I also have a link to my book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics. Thank you.